Continuing our study, Bible Studies for Life series. If you have a copy of your Sunday school book, you may want to grab it. If not, we're going to be in Exodus chapter 20 today, and also in 1 Samuel chapter 26. This is what my copy looks like, Bible Studies for Life. A fresh look at the Ten Commandments, a man after God's own heart. And we're looking at David's life, and we're setting David's life and the circumstances of his life alongside the Ten Commandments and seeing how David did obey those commandments. Of course, especially as we look at today's commandment, we could also set some other circumstances of David's life next to this and see how David violated those commandments. But the idea here is that we look and see ways that in our own life we can take and inhabit these truths, and that we can understand that these are not simply 10 moral things that are good, although that is certainly true. Life and history has proven that. But that these are things that relate to us, the heart of God, and that help us develop the same thing as we seek to be remade in His image. So Exodus chapter 20, verse 13. Today's command is the second command that deals with our neighbor. And if you remember last week, we took and tried to define how the command, honor your father and mother, had both a singular application to the individual and also a national application to the Israelites as a whole. And so today we're going to find that same truth. And that command today is, do not murder, or thou shalt not kill. This is the second commandment, and it is the second commandment that is in response to how man should treat man. The first 4 commandments, if you remember, dealt with how man should respond to God. The next 6 deal with how man responds to man. In other words, how we interact with each other and how we treat each other. And so we started, first of all, with the basic, with the human family, and learning to give value and weight to the people whom we spend time with, and whom the people who have brought us into the world and who have preceded us in the world. As well as now we're beginning to stretch that value. Now, what is someone else's life worth? If I'm supposed to give value and weight to my family's life, then what do I do to those who don't look like me, or act like me, talk like me, etc.? And one of the first things we see is this. This is a personal issue. This is an individual command, just as honor your parents is. This is an individual command to an individual. However, it has national implications. In fact, as we look at David's story today, we're going to see that it had greatly national implications, because David, in his spot to be the next king of Israel, could have taken a life. And in so doing, he would have brought a national reproach on the people. So, as go the leaders, so go the people, or as go the leaders, so goes the nation. Dallas Willard says something along this lines, that we cannot elect people who are different than we are. In other words, we elect the type of people that we really are internally. If our leaders are selfish, it's because we value that within our own lives, and so we've seen it in our leaders' lives, and we say, hey, it works for us and works for me, let's get more of it. If our leaders are merciful, then it reflects to some degree the reality of our desire to also show mercy. And so I thought it's an interesting observation, and he made that after looking at a lot of information and having lived a long life in which he sought to follow Jesus daily. And so what is this issue of murder? Why even would you have to say that? Every culture, while it deals with murder differently, does recognize murder, the unlawful taking of another person's life. Now, for some places, it's justified if certain circumstances occur, or if someone felt slighted, or whatever. We have different definitions of at what point something becomes murder, but every culture agrees that murder itself, the unlawful taking of human life, is wrong. And so why does God bring this out? Well, the reality of it is He is shaping a nation, and the first thing He wants them to understand is not only that do they need to value each other, but the next thing they need to do is value outside of each other, outside of the family unit, outside of the national unit, and they need to look at that. In fact, one of the first instances we see is they were fooled, the Israelites as a nation were fooled by some people who traveled in, claimed to have traveled from a long ways away. I think you can find this story in the book of Joshua, And the Israelites later found out they were duped and they wanted to kill him. And Joshua said, there's no way, bud. We can't do that. We can't just go take their lives. That would be murder because we have an agreement with them. And so, what is this happening here? Well, Jesus tells us in Matthew chapter 5, verse 21 and 22, that murder is more than just the taking of life. Murder is this bitterness and anger and despising of another. And essentially what murder is saying, my life has a value that reaches this level. And your life has a value that reaches this level. And it's somewhere along in this area you are willing for that life that is not up to your level to be erased. And that's what murder is. Jesus says that. Jesus says if you harbor bitterness and hatred in your heart, you've already killed somebody. You've already condemned them to death because in your spirit you have devalued their very existence. This is challenging. Now students, if you're listening, you're going to have seen some things that hopefully they churned your stomachs a little bit. Hopefully they caused you to give thought to these things. I mentioned just this past week, we just had a Supreme Court justice pass away. And I was absolutely, I'm not shocked anymore. I was absolutely frustrated that so many people who claim the name of Christ go on and celebrate, essentially, that individual's death. Now, I can understand a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, a month, 6 months down the road saying, hey, you know what? Now that this person is no longer in this position, there are things we would like to do. There are things that we can celebrate. There are things we can look forward to with hope. But immediately after someone's death, it shows us that more than likely in our lives, in my life, there is hatred and bitterness that I am allowing to build up in me, specifically when it comes to my interactions with people that I disagree with. There's another interesting thought here as God is establishing this new nation, that He is showing them that one of the realities that they're going to face is that possession can lead to murder. Do you remember the story of Cain and Abel? They both gave sacrifices. God accepted Abel's. He rejected Cain's. Cain's response was, I'll kill him. Because Cain wanted what Abel had. And now these people are moving into a new land and you're going to have lots of possessions exchanging hands. You're going to have lots of people having opportunities to get and to accumulate. And they need to understand that murder is going to be a very real reality to do with that. Murder also speaks to the basic relationships of men and women begin with fully valuing human life, which is exactly what Jesus told us in Matthew 5:21 and 22 when He says, if you harbor that in your heart, you've committed murder. And we know this. When somebody does something to you and they've upset you, they've offended you, and if you hang on to that, and if you've ever been through that, and you have, and you just have to think maybe for a moment of a circumstance in your life, and you hang on to that wrong, and it just builds in you, and the next thing you know, you're ready to lash out. Well, that is the behavior that leads to murder. And here's the reality about murder. Murder doesn't end anything. It just sows another seed. You know, a lot of times there's this idea, well, if that person's life is taken, then we won't have to worry about this circumstance. We won't have to worry about this situation. We won't have to worry about this setting. But I think we know, and we can find throughout history, that murder doesn't end anything. It simply sows another seed. So, grab your Bible if you've got it. Turn to 1 Samuel chapter 26. And we're going to look at the story of David and Saul. One of the instances of their life as they meet together in a difficult circumstance where Saul was literally seeking to kill David. David had the opportunity to kill Saul, and he refused it. And we're going to look at his reasoning for doing so. That night, David and Abishai came to the troops. And Saul was lying there asleep in the inner circle of the camp with his spear stuck in the ground by his head. Abner and the troops were lying around him. Then Abishai said to David, today God has delivered your enemy to you. Oh my goodness, can't we make things sound religious? Today God has delivered your enemy to you. Let me thrust the spear through him into the ground just once. I won't have to strike him twice. But David said to Abishai, don't destroy him, for who can lift a hand against the Lord's anointed and be innocent? David added, as the Lord lives, the Lord will certainly strike him down. Either his day will come and he will die, or he will go into battle and perish. However, because of the Lord, I will never lift my hand against the Lord's anointed. Instead, take the spear and the water jug by his head, and let's go. David is out there. Saul is out there with his army for the express purpose of killing David. He has chased David. He has sought him in multiple places, and now he's out there with his army. They fall asleep on this mountainside. This is not intentional that Saul is left exposed like this. There would have been a guard kept. Obviously, the guards has fallen asleep, and David has been able to slip past the guards. He has with him his cousin, Abishai. And if you read David's life, you're going to find out one of his greatest problems was his cousins. And he has with him his cousin, Abishai. And they sneak up on Saul. And I don't know exactly what David thought he was doing. I don't know if he thought if he got close to Saul, maybe he could have a conversation with him. I don't know if he felt like, I don't know what he was thinking. But he was there, and he had Abishai with him. And they've gotten that far, and Abishai looks down, and the picture is that Saul's conked out on the ground, and his spear is stuck in the ground next to him. And Abishai looks at Saul, and he looks at the spear, and he thinks about sleeping in a cave, and he thinks about running and not seeing his family. He thinks about what it's cost him to follow David. And he looks at Saul, and he looks at that spear, and he says, David, one time, one strike, he'll be dead. It's all ours. And there's so much happening here because the people were behind David. A vast majority of the Israelites were behind David. They were ready for him to be king. They were excited about him. He was a national hero. He had killed Goliath. And also during this period of time, he'd also begun to do other things out in the edges of the Israelite country and was looking out for people and all these different things. And so he's a national hero. And Abishai says, man, kill Saul. That's it. It's over with. You're king. The people are going to embrace you. And here's what happened. David refused. Not only did he refuse to take Saul's life, he refused to allow someone else to take Saul's life. And this is critical because it speaks to the fact that even though we may think we can farm out our behavior, we actually don't. If we farm out our behavior, in other words, had he let Abishai take Saul's life, what he was really doing was allowing his bitterness to overflow into Abishai's life. And he was giving Abishai something that he really couldn't or shouldn't have carried. Oftentimes, guys and girls, listen to me, we do that with our friends. You get mistreated by one friend, and what do? Instead of taking and dealing with it and addressing the issue, you immediately begin to spill that over into somebody else's life. And you seek to bring them into your place and into your situation and get them in agreement with you so that you have someone else who is now carrying your bitterness and your anger. And David refused to let Abishai do that. And so in this situation, he's refusing murder. You got to also remember, David had already been anointed to be the next king of Israel. Samuel had already said, dude, you will be the king. David has spent years serving Saul, and now he's spent a period of time running from Saul. He's anointed to be king. I can just see him being like, man, I'm anointed to be king. God's told me I'm going to be king. The prophets told me I'm going to be king. I've killed the giant. I've killed our arch enemy. Let me be king. Let me take his life. And he refused to do that. And here's what he's doing. He is saying this. And I want you to hear this, and I need to hear this, which is why I want you to hear it. David is saying that Saul's living and breathing at that moment had more value than his position as king. Now let's go back to Jesus' definition of murder, which is harboring hate and anger and bitterness in our hearts. And let's ask ourselves this question: how many times am I willing to commit murder instead of allowing someone's life to continue and my position to be reduced? In other words, many times when we're harboring this anger and hatred and bitterness, it's because we feel like our position is not seen as valuable as someone else's. And this is what David is refusing to do, and he's refusing to let Abishai do. David's response for Saul, or to Saul, was predicated on his love for God. Look what he says there. He says, as the Lord lives, the Lord will certainly strike him down. He says, this man's going to die. Either his day will come and he will die. In other words, he may just die from age or circumstances, or he will go into battle and perish. Or maybe he and I will meet on a battle. Maybe he'll meet on a battlefield with the Philistines and he's going to die. Now listen to what he says. However, because of the Lord, I will never lift my hand against the Lord's anointed. David said, my issue is never with Saul. And I want you to understand something. Your issue is never with another individual. It is with God. It is with whether or not we feel like God should have allowed those circumstances to happen. It is whether or not we feel like God should have done something extra for us and maybe reduced others. Whatever it is, our issue is with God. And David knew that. He had already addressed it. I think about maybe he had written Psalm 23. Maybe he hadn't by that time, but he says, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. He's already said, Saul's been chasing me. I'm not afraid of death. I'm going to let him keep on living because my trust is in God. Maybe he had written Psalm 121. I will look unto the hills. From where does my help come? It doesn't come from the hills. My help comes from God, the maker of heaven and earth. I don't know at what point David wrote those things, but I do know this. He had begun to address this in his personal life, and he was willing to submit to God. Let's finish the story. So look over at verses 22 through 25. And I encourage you, take your Bible, 1 Samuel chapter 26. Read the whole story because it's great. But for the time constraints of the lesson and to make the application here, let's move on to this. David answered. And basically what David did is he got on the other side of the valley. And he's back in his camp. And he hollers over at Saul's camp, yo! And he actually doesn't call Saul. He calls Abner, the chief of Saul's army. And he says, Abner, what are you doing, man? And Abner's like, what? And David's like, there was a man in your camp just a few minutes ago who was willing to kill your king. Now, if you're Abishai, you're sitting over there saying, man, what kind of bust did he just throw me under? And Abner's like, what do you mean? And David's like, me and my boy were right there. We were there with you. And, look, here, by the way, here's the water bottle of the king, and here's the spear of the king. This is my proof that somebody was in your camp willing to take the king's life. And so this exchange goes back and forth for a minute, and Saul calls out to David and promises him that he's sorry and that he doesn't mean him any harm. And this is David's exchange back to Saul. David says, here is the king's spear. Have one of the young men come over and get it. The Lord will repay every man for his righteousness and his loyalty. I wasn't willing to lift my hand against the Lord's anointed, even though the Lord handed you over to me today. Just as I considered your life valuable today, so may the Lord consider my life valuable and rescue me from all trouble. Then Saul said to him, you are blessed, my son David. You will certainly do great things and will also prevail. Then David went on his way and Saul returned home. Let's remind ourselves of who David is in this situation. He is the man with God's blessing. He's been anointed to be the next king of Israel. He is the man with the people's passion. He is the folk hero. He is a man now with great strength. He is building an army around him. He is a mighty warrior himself. He has people around him. And if you read 1 Samuel, David had some crazy, strong warrior people that were with him, that fought with a passion, that killed giants, that did tremendous feats of battle. David is now being surrounded by these guys. He is a powerful man. And when he looks over at Saul, and he doesn't say, I'm ready to fight you when you're ready to fight. He doesn't say, don't do anything to me. What he simply says is this: I'm asking God to protect my life. And what he was saying to Saul is this: Saul, are you willing to listen to God when it comes to my life? I listened to God tonight when I stood beside you. Are you willing to listen to God when it comes to my life? And the reality of it is, David didn't know what his response would be. He didn't know how Saul would respond. In this case, Saul does go home. Here's the thing. When David did that, he took this issue of anger and bitterness, and instead of taking a piece of it for himself and letting Saul keep a piece of it, David literally took the whole platter of anger and bitterness and pushed it back across the table and said to Saul, hey, you can have this. I'm not going to eat any. It's all yours if you want it. And Saul turned away in disgust and left it. Now, you can find he eventually tried to take it back and those different things because he just couldn't leave it alone. But David said to Saul, I'm not going to eat from that. Here, you take it. It's yours. I don't want it. No, thank you. Nothing at all. Not even going to take a bite. And he finds himself in this predicament. Murder arises. The desire for murder, the willingness to murder, arises from untreated, unconfessed, undealt with anger, hate, and bitterness. My challenge to you today, if you're a student, you're young, your life lies before you. Begin to deal with these issues right now. Anger towards your parents, address it. Anger towards your siblings, address it. Frustration towards your fellow students, teachers, whoever it may be, address it. Speak to God about it. Tell Him what you're thinking. Not what you think He wants you to hear, what you're actually thinking. And then trust in Him and give dependence to Him. Because here's the truth of it. God values every single life. And He values them all. And you and I are called to value them as He values them. Thank you. I'll see you next time in our Bible Studies for Life series.